Okay.
All right, good afternoon. My name is Sonja Schmid. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Science and Technology and Society at Virginia Tech here in Northern Virginia. And I'm excited to welcome you all to SIREN. This is the 15th event in a series of seminars, talks, and discussion on nuclear emergency response. The series is part of my NSF Career Award on globalizing nuclear emergency response, and in the spirit of this type of grant, we emphasize the importance of both research and education in the area of nuclear emergency preparedness and response. So all SIREN speakers are meeting with graduate students as part of their engagement, and whenever possible, we plan to provide access to a recording of their lectures. SIREN is SIREN stands for Seminar on Interdisciplinary Research and Education in Nuclear Emergency Response. It's generously supported by Virginia Tech's Office of the Vice President for the National Capital Region. Many thanks also to the staff of the Virginia Tech Research Center's Executive Briefing Center and the IT team for their support. And finally, thanks to all the students, staff, and faculty in my home department for helping to make this happen. Before we get started today, I wanted to give you a heads up about two events coming up next week. First, on Monday, December 5th, from 4:30 to 6 p.m., we will host a public panel on the 30th anniversary of an important milestone in nuclear emergency management, the completion of the concrete entombment of Chernobyl's reactor number 4, the so-called sarcophagus. One of the participants will be Nikolai Steinberg, the former chief engineer of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And we'll also hear from a group who spent a couple of weeks in Chernobyl earlier this month and who witnessed the sliding into place of the so-called new safe confinement, a gigantic arch structure that will enclose the reactor and its original sarcophagus. And as I heard on the news this morning, I think they're just about finished sliding it over the original sarcophagus. On Tuesday, December 6th, we'll have our last SIREN talk of the year. Nikolai Steinberg, the aforementioned former chief engineer of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, will share a first-hand account of the tremendous challenges involved in the disaster mitigation and emergency response work at Chernobyl. Steinberg, as I mentioned earlier, was appointed the chief engineer and served in that function for about a year immediately following the accident. Later, he worked as deputy chair of the Ukrainian Regulatory Agency, and in that function was the lead author of an influential report released in 1991 that fundamentally challenged the original human error explanation of the Chernobyl disaster. And based on this report, the IAEA's experts revised their accident assessment from INSAC 1 to INSAC 7. Today's talk will be live streamed, and we have about 40 remote participants signed up as of this morning. These attendees are joining us not only from our main campus in Blacksburg, from other US universities, federal agencies, and national labs, but also from abroad. So welcome, and since this is a one-way street, this live stream, if you have any questions or comments for the speaker, please send an email indicating your name and affiliation to siren@vt.edu. That's SIREN, S-I-R-E-N, @vt, as in Virginia Tech.edu. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Joseph Pilat is a program manager in the Office of National Security and International Studies at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, and he's also a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., where he co-directs the Non-Proliferation Forum. Dr. Pilat served as representative of the Secretary of Defense to the 4th Review Conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and as senior advisor to the U.S. delegation at the 1995 NPT Review and Extension Conference. He also served as representative of the Secretary of Defense to the Open Skies negotiations. Dr. Pilat has held positions in the Pentagon and the Congressional Research Service, has taught at Cornell University, Georgetown University, and the College of William and Mary. He also serves on the steering committee of the Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation at the University of California, San Diego. He's the co-editor of the Handbook of Nuclear Proliferation and Policy, published by Routledge in 2015, and he's the co-author of The Politics of Weapons Inspections, which is forthcoming with Stanford University Press. He holds a PhD in history from Georgetown University, but he's told me that's only one of several degrees in physics, government, philosophy, among others. I first met Joe Pilat at the 2013 Wilson Center Summer Institute on the International History of Nuclear Weapons here in DC. And I had just started my research in nuclear emergency response, which was kind of a strange topic in that group. But he kindly took an interest and told me about his experience in the 1980s when, in the wake of the Chernobyl disaster, the first binding international agreements on early notification and assistance in case of a nuclear accident were negotiated. We've been plotting ever since to get him here, so I'm delighted that the stars have finally aligned, and we'll hear about the origins of these important conventions. Please join me in welcoming Joseph Pilat.
Thank you, Sonia. Let me say at the outset, I'm very pleased to be here. My views are my own, not those of Los Alamos National Laboratory, the National Nuclear Security Administration, or the Department of Energy. It was 30 years ago, and less than 6 months after the Chernobyl nuclear accident, that conventions on early notification in the event of a nuclear accident and on mutual assistance in the case of a nuclear accident or radiological emergency were negotiated at the IAEA in Vienna. The negotiations took about a month, and the two conventions were open for signature at a special session of the IAEA's General Conference on September 26th. The Early Notification Convention entered into force on October 27th of that year, and the Mutual Assistance Convention entered into force on February 26th in 1987. The rapidity of the negotiations, again, just about a month, was rare and in many ways remarkable for international negotiations. You don't ever seen it with something as important as these negotiations. But how can it be explained? The Chernobyl accident occurred on April 26th, as you know. The earliest knowledge of the accident was due to detection by Swedish and Finnish radiation monitors of both debris and gases carried by the prevailing winds. The Soviets were slow to admit there was an accident, and after they did, it was weeks before they really started any significant reporting of information about the accident. For this entire time, the world was in considerable uncertainty about the scope of the accident, and they certainly didn't have a chance to react. There was genuine international outrage at both the accident and the fact that the Soviets were so closed-mouthed about it. The accident was viewed as serious. A lot of meat from Minsk to Stockholm to Oslo was pretty hot at the time, as were other foodstuffs. And there was a cable from one of the U.S. embassies where they were having to address this issue without the appropriate technological background. What the hell is a becquerel? one young member of the embassy in Vienna asked, and it was serious, and we need to remember that. There are concerns about transboundary consequences. As I say, the first word came from Sweden and Finland, not from the Soviet Union. And there was an immediate sense within weeks that a rapid global response to the accident and to the dangers it posed to human health, safety, and the environment were necessary. There were condemnations in the US Congress and the European Parliament and elsewhere in the world of the Soviet inaction and the way they've treated the accident. One US member of Congress called Chernobyl a war crime. Before the end of April, the US Senate passed a resolution calling for an international obligation or requirement, unspecified, into how you do it, for early notification of an accident. And a call for actual convention on early notification was put forward at the Tokyo Economic Summit on May 4th, 1986, weeks after Chernobyl. Again, by this time, within weeks of the Chernobyl accident, the US government decided to support negotiations of conventions, and the Reagan administration decided the same time frame, late April, early May. I was at the Pentagon at the time and involved in those discussions. The interest in extending the conventions to include military activities was unprecedented. The Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Materials, for a long time, the only international convention dealing with nuclear safety, focused on transport of materials in civil use, and the issue of going into the military arena was very difficult. The scope of the agreements to be negotiated, particularly the Early Notification Convention, was therefore contentious from the beginning. And it was contentious at the end of the negotiations, and it remained contentious after the negotiations and is still contentious to some degree today. The Soviet Union and most of the NPT nuclear powers, except for France and the United States, wanted the conventions limited to civil nuclear activities and argued precedent. Most non-nuclear states, a wide range of states from Japan to Indonesia to Iran, to most of the small European states, particularly those bordering on France, and joined by France itself, wanted all nuclear activities included in the scope of the conventions. This was the so-called full scope group, not to be confused with full scope IAEA safeguards, by which people were intended to understand the coverage of all nuclear activities within a state under safeguards. But the full scope group was by far the largest and encompassed most states in the world. The US stood alone between these two camps, with a willingness to include most but not all military activities in the convention. Again, we were insisting that no weapons or weapons testing accidents would be or could be covered by the treaty. But we're willing to include military space reactors, and also most importantly, naval propulsion. And the people from the Pentagon and from the Department of Energy were called into the Office of Naval Reactors before the negotiations began, given a very impressive briefing about freedom of the seas and their importance to U.S. national security and global prosperity, clearly making us understand the stakes of what we were involved in. This was a serious business, and the administration was prepared to move ahead. At the opening of the negotiations, it must be said that agreement didn't appear possible. There was a Brazilian diplomat that led the negotiations on the Early Notification Convention. He found a way to make progress. After several days of airing the views of all the delegates, I believe there were 62 countries represented, he deliberated for a while after assessing the lay of the land and put out a draft for comment and discussion that only he owned. It wasn't a U.S. draft, it wasn't a Soviet draft, it wasn't a European draft. It was his draft. After views were expressed on his draft, he put forward yet another one, and this process continued in this fashion for the 4 weeks of the negotiations. In the end, he had a draft that was largely based on the U.S. view. I think he understood that the U.S. view was the only possible compromise between the views that were out there, and that getting a U.S. buy-in was critical for the potential success of this. I actually negotiated separately, while this was going on, the scope provisions as well as the information requirements designed to protect sensitive and classified information. There were quite a few touch issues here. One of the formulations that we developed to allow naval propulsion and space reactors for military purposes to be included was any reactor wherever located. And you would have thought that that covered everything, and it did in principle. In practice, there were a lot of countries that were very suspicious. There could be a catch that excluded naval propulsion or some other thing. And so there were proposals on land, sea, air, and in space. Well, on sea, is that underwater as well? And the debate went on and on with the sensitive and classified information and its effect on information requirements. The language, if I remember correctly, includes exact location if appropriate. And the reason is that there was concern that if there was an accident to a submarine, for example, that it would be vulnerable to potential attack if its exact location was notified. Were very complex and difficult aside from the overarching issues. But without getting the scope and the information requirements correct, the entire concept wouldn't have worked from the U.S. perspective. And there were a lot of concerns within the interagency looking at this about the way things were developing, particularly when some states demanded that we spell out exactly the types of reactors that were being considered. The draft of the Brazilian president definitely narrowed differences. The Soviets still insisted that only civil nuclear activities be included, although they weren't very vocal about this overall, but they were insistent, and they expressed that insistence to us. The vast majority of states still insisted on full scope coverage of all military and civil activities. France had the most unusual position, and not only the US delegation, but others were puzzled by the French insistence that all activities be included. In the last week of the negotiations, we found out why, and when we approached the French, they wouldn't give an answer except that this is the right thing to do. Turned out that in the last week, one of the former French African colonies put forward a national security exemption as a proposal. So anything that was agreed, you could cover everything, but you could also avoid any kinds of notifications on national security grounds. This was unacceptable, and the poor guy was laughed out of the room practically. It didn't work. On the evening of the last day of the negotiations, the U.S. interagency had a principals meeting that looked at these issues. It was clear that something had to give for these negotiations to succeed, and the Reagan administration was determined that they succeed. In a very difficult and contentious meeting, the U.S. came to an agreement on how to handle this, and we in Vienna, the next day, the final day of the meeting, proposed an article that allowed states to volunteer additional information that would cover those areas not included in the scope, and that was, of course, nuclear weapons and weapon testing. You could say, of course, states always had that right and possibility that they would do that, but having it embedded in the convention was, in the end, acceptable to all states, with an exception. States really wanted action, but the small European states led a group of the full scope group that had lost on critical issues in the convention, especially the scope issue. These states insisted that the only way they would join in on the convention was if the issues that they had not been satisfied on in the negotiations were considered in the IAEA Board of Governors indefinitely, where became a persistent agenda item. And this grab bag of issues, as we called it, allowed the debate and the problems to be carried on for several years before interest levels began to wane. The discussions in the Board of Governors were interesting, and they involved a whole host of proposals. A Swedish proposal that would have curtailed operations of nuclear submarines was put forward. It went far beyond safety. The target was the Russian dumping of old nuclear submarines in the waters near Sweden and Scandinavia. The reason that the Swedes approached us about the negotiations was because the Soviets wouldn't listen, we would. That was the explanation given to me, but it was a non-starter and didn't get anywhere. Russia also used these as a means to wage a counterattack. The Soviets were relatively quiet during the negotiations because I think they were a little embarrassed, but over time the embarrassment waned, and they started raising the issue of U.S. tactical nuclear weapons in Europe in the IAEA board deliberations. This wasn't an issue for the board, but they used the grab bag provision and the scope issue of the conventions to raise it here. They called U.S. nuclear weapons in Europe the West's Chernobyls. And again, didn't come to anything, but they were insistent on it for many years. The mutual assistance negotiations were far less contentious. They could have been, because the issues involved were touched directly on sovereignty, on international liability, as well as costs and reimbursement for assistance. But those issues because they were less consequential. So it was agreed. I'll just briefly outline the two conventions, and we can discuss details later in the Q&A. States party to the Early Notification Convention committed in the event of a nuclear accident that could have transboundary consequences to notify the states that might be affected and the IAEA. And they were also required to provide updated information that might be required as the accident developed. Points of contact for sending and receiving information were to be provided by member states as well as by the IAEA. As I mentioned, the scope included everything, subs, space reactors, and everything but accidents involving nuclear weapons and weapons testing. The compromise that we had proposed and was accepted was in Article 3 of the Convention, and it allowed states to provide such information voluntarily. And at the time, the P5, the 5 nuclear weapon states under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, stated that they would do so as a matter of policy. Information requirements included the nature of the accident, the time it occurred, its location, with the provision that that be exact if that was appropriate and possible, but not if it wasn't. And any other information relevant to mitigation of health and environmental consequences. States party to the Mutual Assistance Convention agreed essentially to an international framework designed to facilitate assistance and support in the event of a nuclear accident or radiological emergencies. States agreed to identify points of contact and competent authorities. The IAEA is very critical, even more critical to this convention than the Early Notification Convention. It was agreed that it could be asked to provide assistance itself, as well as to coordinate international assistance to a state. These conventions were unprecedented, but even at the time, it was clear that they were only first steps to dealing with transboundary consequences of accidents and to the broader issue of international cooperation on the safe use of nuclear energy. Remember, this was still a Cold War environment, and the Russian behavior after the accident reinforced that point. The fact that we were willing to include naval propulsion, among other things, made this very sensitive from the Pentagon and U.S. national security perspectives. I would argue that what was possible at the time was achieved in them. And again, they were unprecedented but limited. Previously, there had been no international agreements or specific requirements under international law for notification of an accident or for mutual assistance. Early notification, you could find similar language, some cases in broader bilateral or regional nuclear agreements where the focus was nuclear cooperation or the provision of assistance broadly, and this was included as a possible case of interest that might occur, but was not the focus of the agreement. And to the extent that there was even such a provision in a few agreements, the provisions were generally very vague, limited, and largely undefined in terms of real obligations. It's interesting that both conventions called for bilateral and regional agreements that would allow states to move forward toward greater obligations or clarity on the issues than the two conventions that were actually agreed could find consensus on. This was, I think, a clear sense that those states that wished to move further than the international consensus could do so. Remember that most of the critical nuclear powers in large countries, both established powers and rising powers, were pretty much on board with not wanting too much interference in their domestic treatment of nuclear energy and the safety issue. It really wasn't intended to push the possibility of these bilateral or regional agreements. So Mr. Blix, in a talk he gave, he was the Director General of the IAEA at the time, in a speech he gave at the conclusion of the negotiations, made that point. I think wrongly. He was an international lawyer, but misread the text of the agreements or misunderstood the intention of at least some of those involved. Neither agreement changed the reality that nuclear safety was and remains primarily a matter of national sovereignty, albeit one with recognized international consequences. The IAEA received key new roles. On information, it was a point of collection, processing, and dissemination of critical information related to not only early notification, but also elements of capabilities and resources and people that would be involved in mutual assistance. And the IAEA also had responsibilities for providing and coordinating responses to an accident or radiological emergency. The IAEA had proposed around this time, a few years later, an emergency response unit tied into and able to draw on global capacity for emergency response and management, but this never came to anything. A key feature of the IAEA buildup of safety infrastructure and programs after Chernobyl was focused on these new capabilities and obligations provided to the agency by these two conventions, and was the centerpiece of a real buildup in the safety element of the IAEA, which had been only a small office prior to Chernobyl. This process took another step forward, unfortunately, after Fukushima Daiichi. It should be noted that the IAEA has also increased its role in nuclear security, especially after the terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001 in the United States. This is a related area where some of the issues become the same, although some are in tension with each other, and where national sovereignty is the major concern and the real focus of international attention. If one looks at the 4 nuclear security summits of President Obama, even though they were designed to and succeeded in pushing element of nuclear security. They are littered with references to national rights, responsibilities, and sovereignty, again, upon close examination of those documents. So, let me just highlight a few of the remaining concerns of these two conventions. As I mentioned, the scope and the limitations on the scope, the fact that it's not universal, despite Article 3 of the Early Notification Convention and the P5 declarations that said that they would, in fact, report accidents, is still criticized by legal experts and those interested in this issue. The fact that there were no specific time requirements for early notification, just a few qualitative words describing promptness, forthwithness, and other things remains a problem. And there is no clear guidance on what requires notification, what level of accident, what kind of transboundary consequences. There's, again, very qualitative terms that require a lot of interpretation and differing interpretations. So no clear guidance on what requires notification and what states should be notified. On the mutual assistance agreement, it was purely voluntary. There are no requirements for anyone to provide assistance. There was no agreement on any obligations, which wasn't surprising. As I mentioned, obligations in this arena would raise critical issues like sovereignty, liability, costs, and the like. So with that, let me close and ask you if you have any questions or comments.
Okay, I will pass the microphone, please. State your name and your affiliation. Name and affiliation.
My name is Larry Heath. I'm a retired physician with an interest in this area. Appreciate your comments and clarification of some of these things. Since Fukushima kind of was the next level 7 event that occurred after Chernobyl, how did the the early notification and cooperation, how would you judge that? I mean, did this have an impact on that, or what? Could you make some comments on that?
It's a great question. Don't know exactly how it handled its responsibilities under the Early Notification Convention. There was a lot of assistance offered to Japan under the Mutual Assistance Convention. I think that when you look at the way that Japan handled information, and the IAEA, led by Japanese Director General, handled information, there was much criticized initially. And so my guess is that if the legal obligations were fully fulfilled, and I presume they were, there were some questions about how well and the spirit of how they were done. That attitude and problem changed fairly quickly, within weeks of the accident, and there became more regular flow. I think that in many ways, because of the way that the accident evolved, it wasn't a perfect test for either of the conventions. But to the extent it was, I don't know precisely how to answer you because I wasn't in a position to follow those things directly.
John Gilstead with Uniformed Services University. Dr. Pilat, could you talk about the international health regulations and how they are, how they compare or contrast? It seems like they're newer, but in some ways even more invasive or intrusive into countries' requirements. And I think they include a rad nuke component, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on them, but one of they do include that component, and one of the things that's clear is that in both the safety and security arenas, states haven't given up their sovereignty in any meaningful way. They're willing to listen to international standards, training. They've been willing to go, in many cases, for best practices to deal with these issues, but they haven't been willing to be obligated directly. I think that in the health area, it's, in my view, largely the same, although I think it is the case that because of the nature of the issue and the politics involved, that there's a willingness to go maybe a step further.
Hi, Philip Eggert, private consultant. You mentioned early on that the IAEA was interested in establishing some sort of international emergency response force, and then that did get a lot of traction and it just kind of faded away. Could you speak a little bit more to that, why it didn't get any traction, and what was the opposition to that, or the challenges to establishing something like that?
Yeah, I think that the short answer is that the Board of Governors would not even seriously consider it. And the longer answer is the same answer that led to the very limited results of the negotiations on the Mutual Assistance Convention. The fact that that kind of emergency response unit would have been an intrusion on sovereignty. It would have raised big issues about reimbursements, liability that really weren't answered fully in the convention negotiations, and also raised about immunities and responsibilities for responders that would come in country. A very contentious issue, and one that comes up for the IAEA, particularly in safeguards, and where states reserve the right to reject inspectors from some countries and aren't willing to provide immunities for them. But it's these issues. The IAEA thought it was on a roll and wanted to take the next step. The member states were not interested. I don't think that there was strong interest from any states, although many of the states in the full scope group that I described in this would have possibly been supportive, but in most cases they were small states on the periphery of power.
Any other questions?
Just a naive question, I'm afraid. Can you tell us about the life cycle of these conventions? Are they going to be expiring? Is there a review process or a recommitment requirement?
No, they're of indefinite duration, and there was no review process. There are possibilities to amend them, but there's been no interest, to my knowledge, of doing so, particularly after the probably the interest in amendments was the highest when the IAEA was considering that grab bag of issues from the unresolved issues from the negotiation. But there hasn't been action to my knowledge.
Just as a reminder to our online participants, if you would like to submit a question, please email it to siren@vt, as in Virginia Tech.edu. Thanks.
Hi, David Orden from Virginia Tech. So two non-specialist questions. You've mentioned the legal obligations under these conventions, but you've also mentioned countries holding back sovereignty largely, and I assume there's no sort of compliance mechanism. So what role do you think the legal obligations play in a context where countries are reserving a lot of rights to themselves and there's no, it's a soft law, there's no really compliance, anyone able to enforce compliance? So what role do the legal obligations play? And then more generally, you talk about liability, and what in general is the situation? Let's say there is a nuclear accident that affects either domestic, but in this case has international effects. What are the liability laws? I mean, what consequences are there for causing damage through a nuclear accident, either domestically or across a border?
Excellent questions. The Convention on Early Notification created some legal obligations for notification, for the types of information that were given, and for follow-on information. There is a lot of possibility for interpretation of many of those legal obligations because of the way that the convention was drafted, and that was as far, I think, as the negotiations could be taken at the time. There is no element for compliance. When I was still at the Pentagon, and can't remember the incident, but within 2 years of the negotiations, the issue came up of whether we should raise an issue of Soviet compliance because of one of their actions, and there was a pretty intense debate in the Pentagon between criticizing the Soviets for bad behavior and setting a precedent that might be used against us in the future in terms of raising questions that might affect the operations of nuclear subs, for example. So we ended up criticizing them, raising the issue, but not going too far on it. There are no real terms for handling compliance, and again, the legal obligations are uncertain enough that it would be very difficult to make any kind of legal case. What is a prompt response? What are transboundary consequences that could affect the health or environment of another country? They're not answered in the agreement, and the potential for states finding a good way to address them, I think, is very limited. On the liability issue, there is a international customary law on liability and what it means, and that means, as I understand it, very little in terms of nuclear accidents. The Soviets did not have any claims against them for Chernobyl.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? They have the Soviets had no what?
Had no claims against them for their liability in Chernobyl. And I think that there's a possibility that there were some things done under the table that were consistent with saving face and national sovereignty, where there was, I can't remember the country, but there was a Soviet trade deal that some viewed as possible compensation for Chernobyl. But there was almost no legal activity that came out of Chernobyl. And if there's nothing coming out of Chernobyl, you know, that tells you, I think, more than anything about what the real state of the situation is with liability. It's a big issue. It's come into play on a lot of occasions. It's affected our ability to cooperate with the Russians on cooperative threat reduction activities before they effectively ended a couple of years ago. It's been an issue. Westinghouse was trying to develop a fuel for use in Russian-built reactors in Ukraine. And one of the issues that was raised and that complicated that effort was the liability issue. So it comes up and is a constant sticking point, but nothing's being done, and it's a tough issue.
So I have a question, Sonia Schmid, Virginia Tech. Could you tell us a little bit more about who negotiated here? You mentioned there was diplomats, there was, you know, historians, political scientists apparently, but what about technical experts? At the time these conventions were negotiated, the emergency response work at Chernobyl was ongoing. So was the investigation into the causes of the accident. It strikes me as a you know, peculiar time to negotiate conventions that will touch on issues such as liability, such as you know, notification of something that they're still in the process of establishing what actually happened. You mentioned that, you know, the wording was really important. What are you supposed to notify about? I mean, Chernobyl is kind of obvious, but again, you know, in terms of being a meaningful notification, you probably need to give a little more background information, you know, what kind of reactor this was, what kind of materials we're talking about, et cetera, et cetera. So who were the people who were negotiating, and why was this, you know, in some ways a good time to negotiate them before the whole, you know, controversy really surfaced about human error or design flaws in this case?
Yes, the very interesting questions. I think that, remember I had indicated there was extraordinary international outrage at the way the Soviets handled this. And I think that spurred the sense that there must be an international obligation to notify the world, the affected states in the case of an accident. That was the real driver of the negotiations, more than the mutual assistance. And a lot of the issues you described come in only with the mutual assistance. So I think that there was a clear momentum for the negotiations. The Tokyo Economic Summit and the Reagan administration were clearly focused and believed this was important. And in many ways, you know, going to domestic politics, there were some who criticized Rahm Emanuel for saying, you know, it's not wise not to use an accident to your advantage. And I think that that was the sense. I mean, there was global condemnation of Soviet behavior. There was near global support for the need to do something internationally. And it came together in these negotiations, I think, at the time. And again, the early notification was clearly the most important at the time, and didn't raise most of the big issues that weren't appropriate, perhaps in a time of crisis, but also were unlikely to be resolved under any circumstance. In terms of the information requirements, you know, there was a fulsome interest in everything that's relevant. Because we included military activities that had to be constrained in order to protect classified and sensitive information. But I think that it is certainly the case that the information that would be required is germane and important in the event of an accident, and it could have important health, safety, and environmental impacts. Secondly, that Article 3 not only refers to the information on weapons and weapons testing that might come into play if there's an accident, but it also refers to any information that's not demanded by the agreement itself. And states can volunteer that. And so I think the situation in terms of the information requirements, I think, is actually quite good given the constraints of the negotiations and those the agreement itself. But it's certainly you wouldn't say that it's ideal from the perspective of a pure health focus, for example. On the expert, I mean, there weren't political scientists and historians there, invited to do this. I was representing the Office of the Secretary of Defense in the negotiations, and there were, because it was in the IAEA, it was designed to bring in the most expertise that you can institutionally, not only with IAEA people, but the representatives of member states. In many cases, they're just diplomats without technical expertise, but in many cases, there were technical experts on the staff of the embassies and also brought from capitals. The head of the British delegation was a radiation health expert. We had a lot of expertise from the Department of Energy and elsewhere in the U.S. government, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, in our delegation. And again, the IAEA had provided assistance, and their people were there. So it wasn't a salon in Vienna, but in fact a serious group of people that were addressing this. I don't think you could have found a better group in practice. I mean, you could probably have created, isn't the world. In terms of the real world, this was as good as it gets, and it was quite good. The Brazilian diplomat, I don't know that anybody but the Brazilian president of the negotiations could have come to a conclusion. And he was just brilliant. And we did this in weather that never, I don't believe it broke 90 degrees Fahrenheit during went under 90 degrees Fahrenheit for the entire time. It was a hot summer in unair-conditioned Vienna.
Any other questions in the room?
Thank you. Yes, Dan Miller, Virginia Tech, a PhD student here. You know, you mentioned constraints on military activities, and you know that's you know to protect obviously classified information. Now, under these conventions, since they've been in place, what has been the response of especially the P5 nations as far as responding to reporting on incidents? I immediately think of the loss of the Russian submarine Kursk, for example. What have the military organizations actually reported?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not in a position to see any of the notifications that are given, but we've been in the fortunate situation that this hasn't come up much during the 30 years of the existence of these notifications. As I said, it came up once when I was still at the Pentagon and could see it, and it was, it was a kind of a marginal case, and was looked at more politically than technically. And my guess is that to the extent that it's come up in the cases of Russian subs primarily, I can't think of any others where it might have really been an issue. I'm sure that it was handled in that same way. I would guess that the Russian position would be very close to the way that it was handled by the Soviets while they still existed, and that is that if there's something the interpretable elements of the obligations make that determination. And there hasn't been a case where the response to a state not making notifications, where people might have thought something was iffy, has ever come bubbled up into a real international incident. So my guess is that we're still in that neighborhood. Everything that's occurred has been below the threshold, except for Fukushima. And Fukushima has some of its own issues in terms of way in which the debris and gases flowed. It tended to go out into the Pacific, and that makes a difference. Had the prevailing winds gone the other way, and the radioactivity was in China or South Korea, it would look very different politically. But again, I am expecting that the Russians didn't negotiate or notify anything because they thought it was below the threshold, and that except for maybe some minor reactions, there wasn't any genuine big reaction to that globally.
So a related question perhaps that came in by email from, and I apologize for mispronouncing your last name, Aoife Uribe, a Stanton Nuclear Security Postdoctoral Fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford. She asks, despite exclusion of weapons and weapons testing from the scope, was there any discussion about voluntary inclusion of a nuclear weapon detonation in the case of unknown origin, for example, a nuclear terrorist attack or the use of a dirty bomb?
In terms of the early notification convention, there was not any real discussion of that, those contingencies. I think that it would have been assumed in the negotiations that had these activities occurred on the soil of a state, that state would be responsible for negotiation, for notifications. But I don't recall the issue coming up. And remember that the interest in nuclear terrorism as a really major public policy issue that leads to governmental responses like the nuclear emergency search teams in the United States was a child of the 70s, and it has waxed and waned over the years, but it wasn't a high priority issue at the time. So I think that it was unlikely. It came up a bit more in the, particularly in the dirty bomb context, in the Mutual Assistance Convention negotiations, where radiological emergencies, which could include dirty bombs, were discussed. But again, the focus was Chernobyl. Most people were thinking about that contingency in the future as the negotiations went on, and the issues that were raised are certainly germane, but they weren't heavily discussed at the time.
Well, we have one more question from Patrick Roberts, Associate Professor in the School of Public and International Affairs here at Virginia Tech. He asks, can you sum up your answer to the puzzle of why there was agreement on these conventions? Was it, as in the French case, that countries believed it was the right thing to do? And when did that period of willingness to come to agreement and place some limits on sovereignty end?
Well, I think that a combination of the outrage against the Soviet behavior, the understandable stakes of the accident and its transboundary consequences, and the belief that if there wasn't an international obligation, state sovereignty would be unfettered and there would be no notifications, or there might not be no notifications, as there were in this case, led to the agreements. I think that if you look at what I said and my understanding of the agreements, states weren't willing to give up their state sovereignty, and I think the provisions of the agreement and the limits on the obligations, particularly in the Mutual Assistance Treaty, reinforced that point. Even in the early notification, we were concerned about what we might say about a submarine accident involving our military. And the French even went so far as to try to cook up a diplomatic scenario where they had a national security exemption for all military activities. And so I don't think states were willing to do meaningful sense during these negotiations, although they clarified the situation in many important ways. Secondly, on these issues, states still haven't given up sovereignty in any significant extent.
Well, I have another question. Was there ever a test case for these conventions after Chernobyl?
Again, there was never a good one. The closest was Fukushima, and there it's a little iffy. And I don't know, because I'm not in a position to see. I don't know exactly what Japan did vis-a-vis the conventions. But it's fortunate in a large sense that it hasn't been there hasn't been a test case that was really clear.
All right, any final questions? for our speaker? Okay, well, in that case, please join me in thanking Joseph Pilat for a fascinating trip into history. And if you have some time, please join us. There's still food out there and some water and juice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure.